Hey, what's up? Recently, I was rewatching 2019 AEW Dynamite clips on YouTube because, as silly as it sounds, I'm already starting to feel nostalgic for early AEW, even though it was only 3 years ago. It's pretty crazy to watch the clips back now. AEW is very fresh, still very much finding their footing, finding out what they wanted to be as a wrestling product. And I gotta hand it to them, looking back at it now, for being a new promotion in 2019, especially when it comes to weekly TV. They did a pretty good job. It wasn't perfect, of course. They still had a few issues that they needed to sort out, like, for example, the audio mixing when it came to entrances and backstage interviews, and at times their camera work left a lot to be desired. But I feel like now they've sorted out those issues for the most part. As far as actual storylines go, I feel like AEW knocked it out of the park in the early Dynamite era. We had the Moxley and Omega feud, we had the Pac and Hangman feud, we had the Cody Rhodes and Chris Jericho feud, the Inner Circle and the Elite feud in general was also really interesting. The one thing that was missing was storylines in the women's division, because as we know, it's been talked about to death, AEW has always had trouble when it came to the booking of their women's division. To be fair though to AEW, a lot of the women signed to the promotion at this point hadn't ever worked on TV before. All I'm trying to say that at that time, a lot of people were giving them the benefit of the doubt when it came to the booking of the women's division. Of course, we know now that they're still having those problems, which is inexcusable at this point, but at that time, we kind of let it slide. So anyway, for a lot of you that weren't watching AEW back then, as I was saying earlier, I was diving down the YouTube rabbit hole when it came to AEW content, and then I stumbled upon the Nightmare Collective. To those who were watching back then, I'm sorry to remind you of this awful storyline. To those who were not watching, this video is basically me explaining why I think the Nightmare Collective is the worst thing to have ever been put on AEW television. To truly understand just how bad and just how much of a flop this storyline was, you gotta understand that AEW was still very fresh and very new, as I had mentioned earlier. I'm pointing this out because AEW was still very much in its honeymoon phase, meaning the crowd was willing to cheer for almost anything on the show as long as it wasn't outright bad. If you were with AEW that early on in its life and you were enjoying the product, chances are, well, you're going to be with them for life. So you wanted the product to succeed. Therefore, if you went to a show in 2019, then chances are you were going to be excited for almost everything on the show, since everything was still so new, as I just mentioned. And at this time, AEW was on a roll. They were mostly staying away from stuff that fans didn't like. And that's when the Nightmare Collective came along. The Nightmare Collective was essentially a subgroup of the Cody Rhodes-led Nightmare family. And keep in mind, this was at a time in AEW where we still weren't even sure what the Nightmare family was, and they were already creating subgroups. Anyway, the Nightmare Collective was this weird cult-like gothic voodoo faction led by Brandy Rhodes. And here's where the thing was destined to fail. The character change for Brandy Rhodes came literally out of nowhere. In her early appearances in AEW, she was, I guess, playing a face, and then literally out of nowhere, one random week, a video package played where she had this sudden change in character. But the beginning of this group did involve Brandy and Awesome Kong, which in a way made sense because Brandy did bring in Awesome Kong to AEW on their first ever show, Double or Nothing. But that was literally the only part of this that made sense. The other jarring thing was that this group debuted as heels, and the reason why this was so off-putting was because this was when Cody Rhodes was having the biggest babyface run of his career during the early days of AEW. He and Brandy literally made their entrance together on the first episode of Dynamite. Then one random week they decided to split them off and give Brandy this real cartoonish heel character while Cody is the biggest face in the company at the time. And outside of one throwaway line in a Cody promo, Cody and Brandy ignored each other throughout the existence of the Nightmare Collective, which narratively never made any sense. And these are only the plot holes. We haven't even talked about how bad it was when it actually hit TV on a consistent basis. So the first time we ever really saw what this group was about was on the buy-in for Full Gear 2019. After the Britt Baker B Priestley match, Awesome Kong and Brandy Rhodes came out to attack B Priestley, who had just been beaten in her match. Awesome Kong did her thing, and then they proceeded to cut a piece of hair off B Priestley's head. Oh, so they're going for a straight edge society type thing, except it's only a small strand of hair, right? Right? As the weeks went on, the Nightmare Collective would try to grow their collection of hairs, sometimes with success and sometimes with no success. And keep in mind that it was never really made clear what the hair was for. I guess if you got your hair cut, you would forever be a part of the Nightmare Collective, but that wasn't the case because the pieces of hair they got did nothing to the first few victims except mildly inconvenience them. The Nightmare Collective would then set their sights on Chris Statlander, and they finally found a new member for their group. And it wasn't Chris Statlander, actually. No, the Nightmare Collective decided to recruit a random member of the audience who for some reason claimed to be a big fan of the Nightmare Collective. In one of the most brutally awkward, cringe, and painful segments that I've ever seen in AEW, Brandy Rhodes and Awesome Kong would completely shave the head of this seemingly random audience member. The random audience member ended up being indie wrestler Melanie Cruz, who was best known for her time with Shimmer. Shocking fact, the video of this segment on AEW's YouTube channel is one of their most viewed videos ever. Anyway, if you go watch this segment, like I said, it was very, very painful to watch. The crowd couldn't give less of a shit, and you can literally hear a pin drop as they're shaving this poor woman's head. Poor Melanie Cruz, who would have her name shortened to Mel in AEW, made a huge commitment to this storyline in her debut in AEW, and the crowd just didn't give a single fuck. Then again, it was awful. It was awful TV. Like I said, AEW was in the honeymoon phase, so the crowd was gonna cheer for almost anything, but this, they weren't even booing. The crowd was just silent. And in wrestling, the only thing worse than a negative reaction is no reaction at all. There was zero reason to care about this since the beginning, but things got even worse when Awesome Kong took a break from AEW to go film Netflix show Glow, because without Awesome Kong, then we were just left with Brandy Rhodes and Mel, and no disrespect to them, but without Awesome Kong, this act falls apart even more in terms of credibility. I think a lot of the Brandy Rhodes go away heat really started with this storyline. I know it did for me, and hey, I'm strictly talking about Brandy as an on-screen character because in real life I've actually met her before and she couldn't have been more nicer to me. But you know, a lot of people don't know how to really separate the character from the real person, and I think a lot of it started here. Like I said, this thing got really bad when the Nightmare Collective was still trying to recruit Chris Statlander. So what they did is they interrupted a match between Statlander and Riho for the AEW Women's title, a match that was actually going really well, but then as they did every time they came on screen, the Nightmare Collective killed the vibe. And it was during all this interference that we saw the AEW debut of Japanese deathmatch legend Luther. Why? I know a lot of you people who meme love Luther, but I feel like at this point he was a sympathy hire for Chris Jericho, and Tony Khan was able to bring him in at a time where the company was still growing and the roster was pretty small. And hey, props for whatever he does backstage, I can respect that. But there's no reason to have this man on TV even back then in 2019. So this dude debuted and immediately got his ass kicked by Riho, so at least there was a positive to his debut. But this now meant that the lineup for the Nightmare Collective was Brandy Rhodes, Awesome Kong, Mel, and Luther. You guys know the Avengers, right? Well, this is like the complete opposite. To this day, this is one of the most bizarre lineups of a faction that AEW has ever put together. After Luther's debut, which by the way got like zero reaction from the audience, there was tons of social media backlash, and if you look up the segment on YouTube where Luther made his debut, you can still see all the negative comments. But the negative comments had to do with how this wasn't working, how this felt very WWE, how we didn't like the interference during a great match, and a lot of people were just calling for the Nightmare Collective to end. Since the very beginning, AEW said that they would always listen to their audience, and well, every single Nightmare Collective segment always stuck out like a sore thumb. This shit was the Codyverse before there was even a Codyverse. This was the Brandyverse. But the biggest difference between this and the Codyverse is that AEW actually put it to an end after realizing it wasn't working. And so the Nightmare Collective would quietly come to an end, and it would be explained on one of AEW's YouTube shows that Brandy ended up going to therapy and now she was cured from all the weird voodoo cult bullshit. The kind of messed up part though is it left everybody else in the group with nothing to do. Awesome Kong did end up retiring from in-ring competition hereafter due to injuries. Luther eventually found his footing and became an AEW Dark mainstay with Serpentico when they formed the Chaos Project. And Mel, well, she easily got the worst of it all. After the Nightmare Collective came to an end, I believe we only saw Mel a couple of times after that on TV, but after that, she was completely taken off TV and decided to sit out the rest of her contract. Mel is the person I feel bad for the most because like I said earlier in the vid, she made a huge commitment to this storyline only for it to fall apart only a few months later. Then there was just no spot left for her in AEW, and we really don't know if that was by mutual decision or not. The Nightmare Collective didn't work for multiple reasons. For one, it had a bunch of plot holes going into it when it came to Brandy and Cody. Two, the lineup of members just wasn't that good. Awesome Kong was the obvious standout, but when once she took time off from AEW, this group was destined to fail. 3. There was no purpose behind the cult-like spooky theme of the group. They were literally cutting people's hair for no reason. At least the Dark Order, which was just getting started around the exact same time, were recruiting people who were tired of losing. And 4. This whole thing felt very WWE on a show that was trying its hardest to be different from WWE. If you think about it, this was the first big storyline in the women's division in AEW, and it ended up failing horribly. But credit to AEW, who stuck to their word early on in Dynamite's history and decided to listen to their fans and scrap this completely. I'm not even kidding, the Nightmare Collective is one of the few times where I was tempted to switch the channel over to NXT during the Wednesday Night Wars. AEW crowds are rabid. It'll take something really bad to completely kill their audience, but that's exactly what the Nightmare Collective managed to do. It's funny because around the time that the Nightmare Collective came to an end, the reports of Tony Khan taking complete control over creative came out. And while Brandy Rhodes has said publicly that she was the one who decided to end the storyline, I wouldn't be surprised if Tony Khan had some say in it as well. Anyway, I'm sorry that I made this video if you had already forgotten about the Nightmare Collective. Let's just all keep pretending that it never happened.